It's on. Not very loud. Is there more music from somewhere else?
Shut out.
Yeah.
Is it because the music is on?
No, music. Something else.
Let's see if you can.
Go ahead. Let's get it going.
Can you hear me now? Guys, it's 10 o'clock. We're going to give it about 5 minutes. We still have some folks coming in. That's okay with everybody. Enjoy, have fun. We'll get started in about 5. Thank you.
That's not we're live. Who comes into a live stream? Come on. For music in the world. Good God, just unplug it all. Go ahead. If you're going to do it, you got to unplug it. It'll be good because I can just tap that thing every once in a while and make sure everybody's awake.
So when you take that
It's
out,
fine. I understand. Yeah. I wasn't the one that unplugged it. It's cold. It's got a little bit of room in there. I know it's the only one.
I have one day on my nose. Yes, I will start. Guys, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Give you like 30 seconds to have a seat. Everybody's bummed because I don't see anyone pouring beer yet. So I promise it's going to happen soon. All right, guys, well, welcome. Welcome to the very first stop on our 6 City Take Human Action tour. My name is Amy. My name is Amy. I'll be your host today. You won't have to hear me talk a whole lot. I'm mostly up here to welcome you, to say hello, and introduce our phenomenal speakers. Just a couple of things. If you know anything about the Mises Caucus, you know we have for a long time carried a 3-pronged strategy that took us straight through the takeover of the Libertarian Party. We've added that 4th prong in our strategy, which is to build culture, to build community, and that's why we're all here today. So I'm so grateful that you would join us. So I want to recognize just a couple of quick things. It is incredibly difficult to put together a 6-city tour, and there is one man who worked on this day in, day out and made it happen. That man is Michael Heiss. He's in the back working so hard. He has done a phenomenal job. I hope you're able to join us on some of the other stops as well. So I recognize Mike, and I want to also mention that in order to make this happen, it was required to have many sponsors who backed this idea of going across the country, providing education, not just like the way we will today, to provide education and build culture, but also to provide incredible candidate training on the second day of every single one of these tour stops. Free to Libertarian candidates. So tomorrow, Larry Sharp will be here from 10 to 2, providing candidate training, getting our campaign managers ready, getting our candidates ready to start taking human action and taking local office. A number of sponsors here today. Let's see, I want to thank Action for Liberty, Sheep Underwear, Bring Our Troops Home, Governors of America, and How to Guns, Tiger Fitness, Replicators, Suppressors, Pack Rest Botanicals, Tiger Trading, Camino Coin, Libertarian Christian Institute, Anthem Planning, Lone Star Injury Attorneys, Liberty Speaks, and Mike Termat for president. And one of the most important things you're able to do today is visit also our sponsor, Fifth Company Brewing out of Perryville, Maryland, and they'll be here pouring beer for you today. Tonight, if you're still hanging out and you want to do the social things with us as well, at 7 p.m. we will be at the Amsterdam Ale House. That is at 340 Amsterdam Avenue. I don't expect you to remember that, but you can come up and find
What street? 76. You know?
I don't know. But I commit to finding out for you. I promise. So
76.
okay. Tonight, Amsterdam Ale House, 7 p.m. Tomorrow, 10 to 2 with Larry Sharp. But most importantly, we're here today. We're going to hear from some incredible speakers. We're lucky to have 7 speakers with us. They are each of them standard bearers that have been instrumental in the liberty movement. And for many of us in this room, they are the reason that we're here today. So their work is incredible. They're our friends in the fight to eke out more liberty in an increasingly unfree world. We're grateful that they're here. And our first speaker today will be Mr. Dale Woolridge. Dale has, Dale has a doctorate in social psychology from the University of Texas. His research on mass uprising offers lessons as the libertarian movement grows and changes. We have a lot to learn from Dale. He is the founder of Action for Liberty, one of our sponsors here today. So we're so grateful that you're here. Come on.
I brought with me today some free goodies and my total back there by the sofa. Thanks to an anonymous donor, I'm able to distribute this. Challenging Authority, How Ordinary People Change America by Francis Watts Gibbon, and it gave me a lot of ideas. And I also have copies of my own write-up, Organizing a Mass Uprising, which I paid for, but you can have it anyhow for free. And that's back there. And a cute little tote bag to carry them in. And I have been giving out this information for different groups for some time. And I think I'll start. How's the sound?
What?
Good.
Okay. I'm going to start by reading something here that really caught my attention. This is, almost all of the labor, civil rights, and social welfare legislation of consequence in the industrial era, like the last 100 years, was enacted in just 2 6-year periods, 1933 to 38 and 1963 to 68. And in all the other years, not much happened, times of normalcy. And I think that's because politicians don't want to address anything that's controversial because somebody will get mad at them, raise a lot of money, and vote them out. Okay. Like Social Security, just mention that term. Your career is dead. Here are some of the things that came out of the 63 to 68 big bangs. That's what she calls it, big bangs. We got the Civil Rights Act of 64, another one in 68, Voting Rights Act of 65, Medicare and Medicaid, anti-poverty programs, just one of which was Head Start. And just a whole lot of stuff. I think our Immigration Act came out of that period. The Gun Control Act, 1968, was in there. And then in 33 to 38, we got Social Security, first minimum wage, housing programs, many of which were for white people only. I mean, Jim Crow was in legislation in all levels of government, just seemed to be everywhere. The labor movement was put on a legal basis. It used to be that whenever there was any kind of a labor uprising, the government would send out maybe the National Guard or the state police and handle it like an insurrection. But this law defined clearly what unions were allowed to do. They were allowed to organize. The legislation prohibiting the oppressive child labor was in there. So what explains those big bangs? Well, Piven noticed that both of them coincided with periods of extremely high levels of grassroots activism. Just because two things happen at the same time doesn't mean that one causes the other. But she went on to provide a very plausible, I think, explanation that links grassroots activism to legislation. And she described a societal process that takes place. In other words, like you do some activism, you block traffic or have a rally or something like that, and then this happens, and this happens, this happens, And then finally, you may or may not get your legislation. And you can't afford to ignore those intervening steps because the process could fail to get started or it could get derailed. And if you really understand it, you can optimize your activism to maximize your chances of success. So that's just one of two general areas where you need to have some expertise if you want to pull off an uprising. The other one is how to get the high level of activism in the first place. And Piven's not much to help with that, so I did some research. I found that in the 63 to 68 period, there was one organization called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee that was by far the most effective force in producing change. It's a Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. Everybody called it SNCC, and that's what I'll call it. And they were a group of just ordinary, mostly black students who had working class backgrounds. I heard a lot that this was a radical group, far left communist. It's simply not true. The leaders of one of these groups was a libertarian, and you had a lot of Republicans, actually, conservatives. So what I'll do is first go through this process that Piven postulated. And I thought her version was very academic and way too much, a lot more information, I think, than activists and organizers really need. So I created a simpler version that I'll present. And then talk about how you get high levels of activism. I know you can't see this. This is my model, a simplification of Piven's. There are 5 bubbles. One bubble feeds into the next. And I think it's a lot easier to describe each of these bubbles and try to, have an amorphous mass. So the process of changing the world starts with disruption, and that means making things not work the way they're supposed to work. And according to Piven, probably one of the best examples of disruption is a strike in industry, because something has to be done. If the product's not getting out. And then there was a communist organizer during the first Big Bang, William Z. Foster. His idea was that a strike in steel was the most effective possible disruption. Chicago in 1963 had really, really good white schools and black schools that were about as bad as you can imagine. And there was a bureaucrat there named Benjamin Willis who was not black friendly, to put it mildly. And the local SNCC group here in Chicago decided to start a boycott. And 250,000 students, notice the big number, mostly with the support of their parents, went out on, they didn't go out on strike, it was a boycott. They stayed home from school. And tens of thousands of citizens marched through the streets carrying signs. And I would call that a disruption. And the outcome was that Benjamin Willis eventually got fired. I think it was a wake-up call, because school districts all around the country, I think, would have noticed that, and they didn't want that to happen to them. And I think another good example is lunch counter sit-in, where some people, black people, maybe some white people, would sit down at a whites-only lunch counter and refuse to leave until they were served, and almost anything would happen. And by using that tactic, they almost eliminated segregation of lunch counters from between 1960 and 1963. And then they branched out. They had like kneel-ins, white churches. Some churches were segregated by law, and they had to be only white people. They couldn't preach to black people. Black people couldn't pray in the church. And they had bowling-ins, bowling alleys, and skating rinks and movies. And they had tactics for all these things. They were actually wiping out segregation and discrimination long before the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964. Okay, after you disrupt something, if you do it well enough, there's a reaction. And then used words like disorder and trauma. Your activism has to create those things. I call it disrupt. I call it. Yeah, that's right. Disorder. For example, one of those lunch counter sit-ins, somebody just came out of that crowd, like right out of the blue, grabbed one of the kids, pulled him down the floor and kicked him until he became unconscious. Of course, the kid couldn't fight back because they were non-violent. And it becomes crazy time. I have another picture here. Unfortunately, you can't see it probably. The police decided that they had to confiscate the signs and the American flags of the protesters. I don't know where they got that idea. And there was one little kid, 5 years old, that was didn't want to give up his flag. The cops there trying to, and they were fighting over this flag. And it was all photographed. I think a video was made. The kid was just bawling his brains out. That's not the way to win the hearts and minds of the American people. The gold medal award winner in Selma, Alabama. About 800 people came over the Edmund Pettus Bridge, voting for voting rights. And they got to the other side, and the police first tear gassed them. The people tripped over, fell over themselves, trying to get away from the gas. And Ku Klux Klan members on horseback came in, trampled them. And then the state police came in and clubbed them. And I'll give you a timeline. Before the election in '64, Lyndon Johnson said he was going to create a voting rights act, and it was going to be wonderful, and it was going to solve all these problems. And he did that. But after the election, he decided to put it aside so that he could work on other things. And then that police riot happened. And then Johnson changed his mind again and sent that to Congress, and it got enacted into law. And I know maybe the police riot maybe didn't have anything to do with his decisions. Just saying. And then all this information that comes from the original disruption to the drama that comes after, all that information feeds into the next bubble, which is debate. And people were talking about all these things that were happening. And I was 16 in 1963, and I remember this really vividly because I hadn't seen anything like it before or since. A newspaper here, this is one of my local papers in Hanover, Pennsylvania. It has a story about, the headline is two Negroes enroll at Alabama school. Imagine that as the headline. And there's a picture of George Wallace there. He stood in the doorway of the college, said the black people could not get in. And he gave a speech and walked away before he could be carried out bodily. Medgar Evers was murdered. Kennedy gave a speech. There's another story about Wallace. And radio, TV, newspapers were all filled with these kinds of stories. And they're coming from everywhere, all the time. And you would go to school, and the teacher would want to have a class discussion on interracial marriage. Go to church, and the sermon was about something Martin Luther King said. And I have a quote. I forget where I got it. The historian Taylor Branch examined a 10-week period in mid-1963, and he counted 758 racial demonstrations in 108 cities involving 14,733 arrests. So that's like an average of 10 of these things happening every day. So what comes next? What's the next bubble? Well, people would start to get fed up. The next bubble is D for desertion. And people start to think that our politicians are not solving these problems. And they start to think what we need to do is vote these people out and get new people in. And you talk about messaging, refining their message. The only message they have is, if you don't fix these problems right now, it's going to be your ass. So when it gets to that point, you have the last D, which is dismantlement. The politicians realize that they now have to solve these problems. They have to dismantle the old polity and create a new polity. And that's what happened. My last picture here, which you can't see, shows LBJ, President Johnson, signing a whole lot of stuff. Okay, so that's the first of two areas that you have to be able to work with and understand. The second area is getting this high level of activism. I hate to keep grabbing these papers. You can't see this. This is us. This is the 17th annual Right to Keep and Bear Arms Rally, which is held every year on the steps of the Capitol in Harrisburg. And it's just really pathetic. A tiny group of people show up. And we're all looking up there where the politicians are, politicians giving speeches, and they're listening to these speeches about mostly what they do, mostly what we do is sit and listen to somebody talk. They were standing, listening to somebody talk. I went to a group on school choice, and they're all sitting at a restaurant, eating, listening to somebody talk, and they never do anything except listen to people talk. Here's another picture of a rally. You can see this. The president of the University of California at Berkeley promulgated rules restricting the political activity of students. which was unconstitutional. And the leader of the local SNCC group at that campus was Mario Savio, and the picture shows him speaking to 13,000 students at a rally. And notice another big number in opposition to the rules. I happen to know that Mario Savio was in Mississippi over the summer, and he was working with SNCC in one of the really tough areas. And he learned the method there. He had to. And I also know that the other leaders of this group that were, most of them were in Mississippi doing the same thing. So, I'd like to describe just overall how SNCC functioned and why they were able to create these big numbers. If you were a SNCC field secretary, that's what they called the people who went out in the field and did this work. If you were a field secretary for SNCC, somebody from the central committee would say, we need to have one of these fighting groups in a certain area in the country. Okay? And you're the one who want to go there and make this group come into being. That was your job, make a fighting group come into being. And what you would do is start talking with people at that place and just kind of get the feel for the community. Let them know that you were there. Start looking for people to become members of this organization you're trying to create. And you would also do canvassing, go door to door, like many American groups do. But they would spend as much as a half a day talking at one house with people. And if you were doing this work, you were always looking for one person, just one person, and that's somebody who's a militant, a badass, and a person who is looked up to and is ideologically aligned with the task. In other words, somebody who wants to somehow raise the black people. And you're trying to find this person. And in Greenwood, Mississippi, which was one of the really, really tough places, they found this guy, Cleveland Jordan. And he was 60 years old, plantation laborer, fourth grade education. That's all right. He tried to co-found a voter education project. Well, there are two things there. He wanted a voter education project that could get you killed at that point. Literally get you killed, because the Klan was in charge of just about everything. They had the judges, they could influence juries, get people on the ballot to just own this place. And he went up against them. So he was a badass. And the other thing is co-found. That means there were probably other people who were just like him. Right? He often spoke about disenfranchisement. Church deacon, great knowledge of Bible. The neighbors took up an annual collection to send him to the National Baptist Convention. So people look up to this guy. And he was an L. That means civic-minded. Also means that maybe he could get a meeting room. So that's who you're looking for. Here's another one. I've been friends with this guy on Facebook for a long time. He was a ninth grade student when they contacted him. He was, for his activism career, he was He was arrested 109 times, and he was on death row at the age of 13. He got arrested for being in a restricted area. They took him to death row. They didn't tell anybody where he was at. His mother had search warrants looking for him. They kept telling him he was going to be fried, and they were going to put him in a gas chamber, things like that. And they did that for a few days, and then let him go. Mom said, "Where have you been?" He said, "Death row." So he wrote this book, Pushing Forward, and he writes that a man by the name of James Bevel, now I recognize that name, he was a slick guy, started talking to him, and this is going to be a recruitment operation. It's not anything pedophilic. And this guy would come to the house when Hezekiah's mother was at work and take him out. And one day he would, for example, take a bus ride and then show how the black people had to sit in the back. You had to go through the back door to get in, things like that. And then they would get hungry and go to a restaurant, and this guy would explain the black people had to go in the back door. They weren't allowed to go in the front door. And things like this one wants to put some time. I was spending a lot of time trying to recruit Hezekiah. And then later on, talks about this friend of his named Lawrence Kaya. I recognize that name. He's a slick guy. They were coming at him from different directions. This guy was 8 years older than him. That's what it was. What they were trying to do was they had this high school kid, I guess ninth grade, I think was high school or middle school. So he would have been about 15. He was really looked up to by the other kids because he was on death row and he was a badass. And if he was working for SNCC, then the other kids would want to work for SNCC. And in the case of Cleveland Jordan, if he was working for SNCC, it must have been okay with Jesus. So that's the way they built. They built organizations based on this kind of thinking about how you influence people. And then when you get maybe 5, some of the books say you need about 20 people, maybe 40. I think you only need 5 or 10. Black Lives Matter was started by just 3 young women. And the Serbian group that took down the dictator Milosevic, they started with 11 Augustines. So you get people like that together, that's your new organization, and it's a decentralized revolution. Nobody's outside is telling them what to do. It's my 5-minute warning. And that is basically the process. A couple of other things, though. Oh, about that James Bevel guy. You might have seen this. This is Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King giving an award to the people that King thought deserved most of the credit for King's success. So he was like King's MVP. And they had a meeting protocol, which they really loved. And that's described in a book called Freedom is the Endless Meeting. So meetings had to be very, very long. And unfortunately, that's someone like me, that's almost unreadable because it's extremely dense and academic, but it's the only thing we have. So I actually have just a 4-page summary of the ideas, how they did meetings. And I think it's very important to know that part of it too. And then just one little topic to wrap it up. I went back to the first Big Bang, the one in the 30s, and I found that the organizers there were the Congress of Industrial Organizations, CIO, and the organizers were mainly communists. And one of the very best communist organizers was this guy, William Z. Foster. And he wrote several books about how they organized. It's basically the same set of ideas, the same method. Theirs was adapted to labor, and it was cruder. It's like 1930s cars versus 1960s cars. And it makes it look to me like there is this one method that you can learn fairly easily. I mean, a 7-year-old learned this method and applied it in Birmingham, Alabama. And there's this one method that you can consider for organizing a mass uprising. During my lifetime, there have been hundreds of mass uprisings in the world. The odds of success are fairly good as long as it's non-violent, better than 50-50. They are increasing in frequency. In the 21st century, we've already had many more than the entire 20th century. So I think people around the world are realizing that they don't really need Putin and Xi, the mullahs in Iran, and they would like to be rid of them. Here's a method for getting rid of them. I think that is the mission for us in the 21st century. And I think our frontier is the public schools. That's the people I would like to see us try to reach. And I told a Republican a couple of months ago, and I thought we should be organizing the kids, encourage them to go out and strike in school. And she laughed. She thought it was a joke, and it wasn't a joke. Well, thank you for listening to me.
Phil, I know you are focused on today talking a little bit about mass uprising. What is interesting for me is when you describe the person who can motivate others, that badass that you're looking for. I think a little bit about the candidates that the Mises Caucus endorses, that the Mises Caucus works with. So make sure you keep an eye out for those endorsed candidates when you have an opportunity. A little bit of noise. We're going to roll right into our second speaker. Okay, we're going to take a 5-minute break. All right, we're going to take a 5-minute break, and at 10:50, we're going to come back and hear from you.
Good, all right.
That really is. And people are back and all of us, like, people like that, you know, like, model. And the good one. It's the same
I've loosened those up. If you can just, as I move these things, feed these cables to me so that they're.
I see what we're doing.
I don't know what's going on, but we're gonna have to shut those doors too, because that is just about as loud for the people in the line as the people speaking. All of the comments can say are how audio is.
Is this for your
directed mic.
It is just it's not a great quality. I mean, we're running with my immature setup here, so. Yeah.
That idea if the microphone was maybe just
Yep. Right there. Perfect. Right in. Good. The road yeah, so this had to all come closer to rectify that a little bit.
Just about every.
We're good.
I mean, modern recording is okay.
Well, I forgot to record the first one, so they'll all be good from here. And it's live recorded on YouTube and stuff, but the high quality I didn't catch for the first one. Whenever you're ready, we can roll. Call everybody back to their seats. You want me to do it?
I also let them know that tell them to come back. You can talk it in. Sorry, I just wanted to. This is I just wanted to introduce you to Dale. He does live in the Okay, cool. I'm the chair of the York County Libertarian I was born in 92 when
I don't know when he's gonna be here. I'm not sure.
Okay, cool.
Like, I don't know anything.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. You can try to catch it, but I'm sure there are a lot of people in here.
You're there and you've offered and I appreciate it. Thank you so very much. So thank you for coming to New York.
Absolutely. Yeah, he's certainly gonna be here. I'm not sure how long.
Okay.
I drove up this morning. I'm over there with the Libertarian group. I went to New York
Guys, we're gonna give everybody about 30 seconds to get back to their seats, and we're gonna get started with our next speaker.
Next speaker, everyone, back to
Yeah,
stage.
Scott.
any material.
No, I guess not. Now you're making me nervous. I'll have to like pay close attention to it.
I think the first time I heard you.
Guys, we're gonna go ahead and get started. Our second speaker is Keith Knight. Most of you know Keith's work. Keith coming from the Libertarian Institute, serving as the managing editor there and the author of Voluntary's Handbook, host of Don't Tread on Anyone show, and in our fight to shed light on some of the most horrendous of human rights abuses in places like Yemen and Ukraine. We all are vested in and have benefited from the work at the Libertarian Institute. So we are grateful to have Keith here today. Keith, come on up. We're welcoming you to come on and speak. We're grateful that you're here. It's all you.
LPMC, thank you guys so much for having me. A lot of people are familiar with the concept that war is the health of the state, that in a time of war when there's an external enemy, governments are able to get away with rights abuses they wouldn't otherwise be able to get away with in a time of peace. Today, I want to make the case that the state is the health of war, that the inverse is also true. When it comes to having things like a central bank, the ability to issue taxes, compulsory education, the ability to conscript people against their will, and the legal double standard that when the state kills, it's called collateral damage, but when anyone else does, it's murder. So I want to make the case that if anyone is to be principled in their anti-war position, they must also be anti-state and embrace the non-aggression principle. One thing comes to mind when we think of why the state is the health of war. A number of people will say that, well, governments are here to protect us from these conflicts, yet government is so often the source of conflict because they so seldom bear the cost of bad decisions. On June 12th, 2016, a man named Omar Mateen was in the Pulse nightclub. He went in and murdered 49 people and injured 53. He then held a number of people hostage and called 911. He said on the 911 call, "You have to tell America to stop bombing Syria and Iraq. They are killing a lot of innocent people. What am I to do when my people are getting killed over there? You get what I'm saying? You need to stop the US airstrikes. Tell the US government to stop the bombing. They are killing too many children. They are killing too many women, okay? I feel the pain of the people getting killed in Syria and Iraq. They need to stop bombing Syria and Iraq. The US is collaborating with Russia, and they are killing innocent women and children, okay? The airstrikes need to stop and stop collaborating with Russia. The fucking airstrikes need to stop. You see, now you feel how it is." Crystal clear what his motives were. 4 days later, Barack Obama came out to address the nation, then President Barack Obama. Here was Barack Obama's interpretation of what happened. "This was an attack on the LGBT community. Americans were targeted because we're a country that has learned to welcome everyone, no matter who you are or who you love. And hatred towards people because of sexual orientation, regardless of where it comes from, is a betrayal of what's best in us." Donald Trump also commented on this, so both ends of the political spectrum, we should see a great deal of variety. What Trump said was, "This is a very dark moment in America's history. A radical Islamic terrorist targeted the nightclub not only because he wanted to kill Americans, but in order to execute gay and lesbian citizens because of their sexual orientation. It's a strike at the heart and soul of who we are as a nation. It's an assault on the ability of free people to live their lives, love who they want, and express their identity." So both the president and then the future president completely lied about what happened. If you look at the Council on Foreign Relations, they actually keep a tally of the number of bombs dropped in Syria and Iraq in the year of 2016, which Omar Mateen committed this blowback atrocity. In Syria, the US dropped 12,192 bombs. In Iraq, 12,095. The Intercept did some research and found that 90% of those killed in drone strikes were not the intended target. And in order to be a target, it often just means a male of military age. Not anything new. George Bush on September 20th of 2001 said to Congress, "Americans are asking, why do they hate us? They hate what they see right here in this chamber, a democratically elected government. Their leaders are self-appointed. They hate our freedoms, our freedom of religion, our freedom of speech, our freedom to vote and assemble and disagree with each other." Here's what bin Laden actually said in a pamphlet titled Tactical Recommendations. "Then the fighters realized that the gang in the White House could not see things clearly, and that their leader, that idiot they obey, was claiming that we envied their lifestyle, when in truth, which this pharaoh would like to hide, is that we are attacking them because of their injustice toward the Muslim world, and especially Palestine and Iraq, as well as their occupation of the land of the two sanctuaries. When the fighters saw this, they decided to come out of the shadows and take the fight into their territory, into their homes." So George Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump are completely lying about the origin of the atrocities that Americans have to suffer with. This is why the Libertarian Party and the LPMC especially is so vitally important. If you look at the LP platform, it says, "We oppose all acts of initiating violence, whether done by private actors or the state." Only this approach is something that can really get to the root of our problems. The Democrats and Republicans will clearly have us fighting over citizen versus immigrant, black versus white, man versus woman, rich versus poor, all of this arbitrary nonsense. When it comes to the most justified war that people can think of, a number of things come to mind. Afghanistan, the First World War, the Second World War. I want to go over those examples and talk about the importance of historical narratives. When it comes to the war in Iraq, things have recently gotten so bad that Max Boot, actually one of the great neocons, came out in Foreign Affairs magazine and said, "What neocons got wrong and how the Iraq war taught me about the limits of American power." Boot says, "Regime change obviously did not work out as intended. The occupations of Afghanistan and Iraq were in fact fiascos that exacted a high price in both blood and treasure for both the United States and even more, of course, the countries it invaded. So if you so much as walk into the Capitol building without a permission slip, you are a terrorist. You are going to prison. Governments invade countries and murder civilians and ask us to thank them for their service. When it comes to the importance of historical narratives, Vivek Ramaswamy, one of the presidential candidates from the Republican Party, said, "To summarize my foreign policy, we need less Chamberlain and more Churchill." This goes to show that instead of making any principled arguments, instead of giving actual examples, all you have to do is say, Chamberlain bad, Churchill good, Hitler also bad. And that is how they are able to control the minds of the masses. Getting into the First World War, one of the bloodiest conflicts in history, the millions of people that died from this as a causal result of government, it is really shocking that every child who has ever performed labor, well, but you have to take the heat on that because you advocate the free market, so you're responsible for all child labor. Yet when governments commit mass atrocities, government advocates don't really feel the need to have the caveat, I am really against that aspect of this organization. They just say, well, I certainly hope they change things. And of course, they would never let us get away with something so ridiculous. It's the equivalent of saying, you know, I like the free market, but all of the CEOs are bad except like one or two. This is what government advocates are essentially saying when they say, well, I support government, but not these huge atrocities that they commit. When it comes to the First World War, the assassination of Franz Ferdinand provoked Austria-Hungary to declare war on Serbia. Russian mobilization for Serbia to defend them provoked Germany to declare war on Russia and France, the ally of Russia. The German refusal to respect Belgian neutrality provoked Great Britain to declare war on Germany, according to a treaty from 1839. So just like that, a few decision makers are able to arrange things in such a way where millions of men are conscripted, millions of people die, children are growing up without parents, men are coming home with half of their face blown off, with their kids terrified to even speak to them. And we are called greedy and heartless for advocating voluntary interactions between consenting adults. And these people don't see too much wrong with this. In America alone, there were 116,000 military deaths from the First World War, to which people respond, well, the Germans sank the Lusitania, we had to declare war on them. The reality of the situation is the Imperial German Embassy on April 22nd, 1915, sent out a notice to a number of travelers in the Atlantic. It says, notice, travelers intending to embark on the Atlantic voyage are reminded that the state of war exists between Germany and her allies and Great Britain and her allies. The zone of war includes the waters adjacent to the British Isles that, in accordance with formal notice given by the Imperial German government, vessels flying the flag of Great Britain or any of her allies are liable for destruction in those waters, and that travelers sailing in that war zone on ships of Great Britain or her allies do so at her own risk. So this is supposed to be the ultimate justification. Germans going out of their way to warn Americans, there is a state of war between us, and the German brute is how this is discussed by historians and the media. Lusitania situation is actually worse. There was a man named Colonel Ed House. This is who Woodrow Wilson described as his second personality. The president of Yale, Charles Seymour, in 1926, collected a number of papers from Colonel House and published the intimate papers of Colonel House. And on this, in this section, he writes on page 432, on the morning of May 7th, House and Gray drove out to Kew. We spoke of the probability of an ocean liner being sunk, recorded House, and I told him if this were done, a flame of indignation would sweep across America, which would itself probably carry us into the war. An hour later, House was with King George in Buckingham Palace. We fell to talking, strangely enough, the colonel wrote that night, of the probability of Germany sinking a transatlantic liner, House said. Suppose they should sink the Lusitania with American passengers on board. That evening, House dined at the American Embassy. A dispatch came in stating that at 2 p.m, German submarine had torpedoed and sunk the Lusitania off the southern coast of Ireland, many lives had been lost. Talk about a coincidence. Colonel House, Woodrow Wilson's second personality, finally gives him the justification for declaring war. Now, Wilson actually doesn't declare war in 1915. He runs in 1916 on a platform of "he kept us out of war." Yet April 2nd, 1917, Woodrow Wilson did declare war on Germany. To Congress, Wilson said, "The world must be safe for democracy." He then initiates a world war which leaves Russia in the hands of Lenin, Italy in the hands of Mussolini, and Germany in the hands of National Socialist Adolf Hitler. Even with the best of intentions, these are the results government policies give us. Its peace must be planted upon the tested foundations of political liberty. We have no selfish ends to serve. We desire no conquest, no dominion. We seek no indemnities for ourselves, no material compensation for the sacrifices we shall freely make. We are but one of the champions of the rights of mankind. We shall be satisfied when those rights have been made as secure as the faith and the freedom of nations can make them. Sacrifices we shall freely make, of course, didn't apply to the Selective Service Act of 1917, which conscripted 2.8 million men ages 18 to 45 against their will. The white pill in this is a man named George Creel, who was chairman on the World War I Committee of Information, said that in order to enforce conscription, they had to have a propaganda campaign, which included 756,000 leaflets and hiring 75,000 speakers. So still, one thing I want to get back to is the need for general public opinion. And that is where the LP comes in. That's especially where the LP&C comes in. So wrapping up on the First World War, 1.8 million Russian deaths, 2 million German deaths, 1.3 million French deaths, 1 million deaths in the Habsburg Empire, Austria-Hungary. The United Kingdom, 920,000 deaths, 460,000 deaths in Italy, and 116,000 American deaths. And the free market advocates are called dog-eat-dog competitors who are just out to get a dime or a nickel, and they just care about money. But when governments murder people for money, it's only social justice. When it comes to the Second World War, this is known as the Good War. You would think the Good War is something where like no civilians died and leaders came together and ushered in peace and prosperity. The Good War killed tens of millions of people, and yet they still use it as a talking point. That is the power of historical narratives. On September 1st, 1939, the National Socialists invaded a part of Poland called Danzig. This was a city that was formerly German, and on that day was 98% German. As a result of this, Neville Chamberlain was the one who declared war on National Socialist Germany. On September 3rd, 1939, Neville Chamberlain said, "This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note, stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently, this country is at war with Germany." One person, or a couple people, being able to unilaterally issue millions of people to their deaths. That is what we're dealing with when it comes to the state. Winston Churchill gave a brief explanation of the actual motivations behind why governments declare war on each other. This was in a conversation with Lord Londonderry. Churchill said, "British policy for 400 years has been to oppose the strongest power in Europe by weaving together a combination of other countries strong enough to face the bully. Sometimes it is Spain, sometimes the French monarchy, sometimes the French Empire, sometimes Germany. I have no doubt who it is now. But if France set up to claim overlordship over Europe, I should equally endeavor to oppose them. It is thus through the centuries we have kept our liberties and maintained our life and power." So notice it has nothing to do with, if we're threatened, then obviously we'll defend ourselves. When governments go to war, it's about them getting more money, more power, and opposing any competition. Capitalist competition, voluntary exchanges, that's evil and greedy, governments murdering people. Well, you just have to pledge your allegiance to that. The Churchill myth is so powerful because so many people simply just buy into the fact that well, you gotta be like Churchill, you're courageous and helping. Well, Winston Churchill, when he was First Lord of the Admiralty on August 12, 1914, initiated a blockade of Germany. And according to Martin Gilbert, this death total, as a cause result of the blockade, people not being able to trade goods, totaled 762,106. More death by statism. Churchill also initiated Operation Catapult, which was an attempt to kill 1,300 French servicemen off the coast of Algeria, claiming that, well, had we not killed them, the National Socialists would have gotten the ships and probably used them against us. The worst crimes of Churchill began on May 15th, 1940, when he initiated the bombing of civilians. Germany did not bomb civilians until May 6th, 1940. This was a plan dreamt up by a guy named Frederick Lindemann, summarized by C.P. Snow, a science advisor to the royal government, in a speech titled Science and Government, the God-Given Lectures at Harvard. C.P. Snow summarizes what actually happened in this bombing campaign. The paper laid down a strategic policy. The bombing must be directed especially against German working class houses. Middle class houses have too much space around them and are bound to waste bombs. The paper claimed that given a total concentration of effort on the production of bombing aircraft, it would be possible in larger towns of Germany, that is, those with more than 50,000 inhabitants, to destroy 50% of the houses. J.M. Spate, the principal secretary of the Air Ministry, wrote a book called Bombing Vindicated in 1944, also summarizes this policy. He says, because we were doubtful about the psychological effect of propagandist distortion of the truth, that it was we who started the strategic bombing offensive, we have shrunk from giving our great decision of May 11th the publicity which it deserves. It was a splendid decision. It was as heroic, as self-sacrificing as Russia's decision to adopt her policy of scorched earth. They did this in a number of German cities: Dresden, Leipzig, Hamburg, Berlin. Winston Churchill supported the National Service Act of 1939, one of the most vicious forms of enslavement, forcing people to perform labor against their will, getting their limbs blown off, dying. And in criticizing Neville Chamberlain's alleged appeasement, not going to war, this was because at a Munich conference, Neville Chamberlain said, if the National Socialists take a portion of Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland, Britain will not declare war on National Socialist Germany. Well, they ended up declaring war over Poland, and after tens of millions of deaths, Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union had control over Albania, Bulgaria, all of Czechoslovakia, not just the Sudetenland, Hungary, East Germany, Poland, Romania, and Yugoslavia. It's important to note that the war guarantee that Britain gave to Poland, we will go to war on your behalf, we're here to defend you, led to millions of Poles getting killed in the Second World War. So when Republicans claim, well, we're going to give Taiwan a war guarantee, they're not doing Taiwan any favors. When Republicans or Democrats say, we're going to give Ukraine a war guarantee, they are not doing Ukraine any favors. Also, there was no declaration of war against the Soviet Union, even though the Soviets invaded Poland 14 days later. Winston Churchill summarized in March of 1948 his take on the Second World War. He said in a book titled The Gathering Storm, the human tragedy reaches its climax in the fact that after all the exertions and sacrifices of hundreds of millions of people and the victories of the righteous cause, we have still not found peace or security, and that we lie in the grip of even worse perils than those we have surmounted. That is the cost of war. Half of Europe going to Stalin after tens of millions of deaths in order to declare war as a method of protecting Polish independence. When it comes to Pearl Harbor, this one is constantly thrown at us. We've already gone over the 9/11 line. Well, the isolationists sort of had their time in the sun, but then Pearl Harbor happened, and then now no one has, any reason to oppose going into war. In 1947, a book titled The Story of the Secret War was published by George Morgenstern. He quotes the diary of Henry Stimson, the Secretary of War. On November 25th, Henry Stimson, so 13 days before Pearl Harbor, Stimson says, the president brought up entirely the relations with the Japanese. He brought up the event that we were likely to be attacked perhaps as soon as next Monday, for the Japanese are notorious for making an attack without warning. And the question was what we should do. The question was how we should maneuver them into the position of firing the first shot without allowing too much danger to ourselves. After Pearl Harbor, Stimson says, when the news first came out that Japan had attacked us, my first feeling was of relief, that the indecision was over, and that a crisis had come in a way which would unite all our people. This continued to be my dominant feeling in spite of the news that catastrophes, which quickly developed. For I feel that this country, united, has practically nothing to fear, while the apathy and division stirred up by unpatriotic men had been hitherto very discouraging. This was also the policy of Franklin Roosevelt. In a conversation with Winston Churchill, published in the New York Times, titled War Entry Plans Laid to Roosevelt, Churchill says, he, Roosevelt, obviously was determined that they should come in. This was in August of 1940. As Roosevelt was telling the nation, I will not send your sons into another European conflict. Churchill said the president had said he would wage war, but not declare it, that he would become more and more provocative. If the Germans did not like it, they could attack American forces. The president ordered these United States Navy escorts to attack German U-boats, which showed itself, even if it were 200 or 300 miles away from the convoy. Everything was to be done to force an incident. The president had taken this very well and made it clear that he would look for an incident which would justify him into opening hostilities, Churchill told the War Cabinet, according to the minutes of the meeting. In 1999, a book titled Day of Deceit was published by Robert Stinnett, and he talks about a document titled the McCollum Memo. This was by Arthur McCollum, a naval intelligence officer, and he says, here are 10 things we can do in order to get us into a conflict with Japan, since public opinion is completely against us. McCollum says, it is not believed that in the present state of the political question of the United States government is capable of declaring war against Japan without more ado, and it is barely possible that vigorous action on our part might lead the Japanese to modify their attitude. Therefore, the following course of action is suggested. Give all possible aid to the Chinese government, Chiang Kai-shek. Send a division of long-range heavy cruisers to the Orient, Philippines, and Singapore. Keep the main strength of the U.S. fleet, now in the Pacific, in the vicinity of the Hawaiian Islands. Completely embargo all U.S. trade with Japan in collaboration with similar embargo imposed by the British Empire. If by these means Japan could be led to commit an overt act of war, so much the better. At all events, we must be fully prepared to accept the threat of war. The Pearl Harbor intentionally provoked attack is what justifies, through the historical narrative process, the things such as Operation Meeting House, killing 100,000 Japanese civilians in March of 1945 in Tokyo. Hiroshima and Nagasaki estimates, the lowest estimates you can find, 129,000 dead civilians as a cause result of the nukes. And we are still labeled with the title that we are the greedy ones for daring to want people to engage in voluntary exchanges. Unfortunately, governments have not cared to learn their lesson and are currently provoking a third world war, especially Joe Biden, Antony Blinken, and Jake Sullivan. This is important because in 1990, there was a document from Secretary of State James Baker in a memorandum of conversation between Mikhail Gorbachev and James Baker. Baker has a conversation with the head of the Soviet Union, and he says, the president and I have made clear that we seek no unilateral advantage in this process. We understand the need for assurances to the countries in the East. If we maintain a presence in Germany that is part of NATO, there would be no extension of NATO's jurisdiction for forces of NATO 1 inch to the east. Since 1990, the US government has completely gone back on that. They have added countries to NATO. This includes the Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland, Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia, Albania, Croatia, Montenegro, and North Macedonia. Just as the Americans did not want Soviet missiles in Cuba and were willing to go to war over it, Russia is willing to go to war if the US continues to expand NATO and tries to bring Ukraine into NATO. So instead of doing this officially, as was proposed by George Bush, what happened was they decided to stage a coup. The warning about what could happen actually came from the current director of the CIA, a guy named William Burns. He was formerly a US ambassador. Burns wrote a document titled Niet Means Niet, Russia's NATO Enlargement Red Lines. In 2008, Burns says, following a muted first reaction to Ukraine's best intent to seek a NATO membership action plan at the Bucharest summit, Foreign Minister Lavrov and other senior officials have reiterated strong opposition, stressing that Russia would view further eastward expansion of NATO as a potential military threat. NATO enlargement, particularly to Ukraine, remains an emotional and neurologic issue for Russia, but strategic policy considerations also underlie strong opposition to NATO membership for Ukraine and Georgia. In Ukraine, these include fears that the issue could potentially split the country into two, leading to violence or even, some claim, civil war, which would force Russia to decide to intervene. A coup was staged by the National Endowment for Democracy, people like Victoria Nuland and John McCain. Here is what John McCain said in 2014 while in Ukraine, helping to oust the President Viktor Yanukovych. What we're trying to do here is bring about a peaceful transition here. The word is very clear that he, Putin, has made certain threats. Whether he would carry them out, though, I don't know. Chris Murphy was on C-SPAN in 2014 talking about the Ukraine incident. He said, I think it was our role, including sanctions and threats of sanctions, that forced, in part, Yanukovych from office. So they are de facto making Ukraine a NATO country by installing a puppet regime. Lindsey Graham was also in Ukraine. He said in 2017 to Ukrainian soldiers, your fight is our fight. 2017 will be the year of offense. All of us will go back to Washington and we will push the case against Russia. Enough of Russian aggression. It is time for them to pay a heavier price. The Soviet Union finally falls, every Cold Warrior's dream. And just like in the First World War, when the countries bullied up on Germany, they have done the same exact thing to Russia and have now driven Vladimir Putin into the hands of Beijing. Adam Schiff spoke to Congress in 2020. He said, the United States aids Ukraine and her people so that we can fight Russia over there and we don't have to fight Russia over here. During this time, they were not just surrounding Russia with NATO bases and weapons, they were vilifying the head of Russia, just as they vilified Saddam Hussein and David Koresh and Muammar Gaddafi and Bashar al-Assad. Hillary Clinton said 17 intelligence agencies, both civilian and military, have confirmed that it was Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin who hacked my emails. Said this for a year, said it on the presidential debate stage while the world was watching. A correction was issued by the New York Times, June 29th, 2017. The assessment was made by 4 intelligence agencies, the DNI, the CIA, the FBI, and the NSA. The assessment was not approved by all 17 organizations in the American intelligence community. You would think that these people who just blindly live to serve us all would have come out and said, Secretary Clinton mistakenly said 17. We don't want to provoke a war with Russia. We never came to that conclusion, but they sat on their hands. Also, Joe Biden on the presidential debate stage said, I don't understand why this president is unwilling to take on Putin when he's actually paying bounties to kill American soldiers in Afghanistan. Of course, this story was redacted. NBC says, last fall, while Biden was a candidate, Pentagon officials told NBC News that they could not substantiate such bounties were paid. They then tried the same exact Russiagate thing again in 2020. Politico has a headline, Hunter Biden's story is Russian disinfo. Dozens of former intel officials say more than 50 intelligence officials signed a letter casting doubt on the provenance of a New York Post story on the former vice president's son. 50 intel officials all got together, lied, and said Russia hacked our elections yet again. So who is the real threat? Russia, China? No Russian ever made me sign up for conscription. No Chinaman ever took 30% of my income and regulated my business out of existence. Yet, when it comes to who we're supposed to hate, Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, told the Council on Foreign Relations this year, foreign policy, like all policy, is about trying to protect and defend our way of life. And what we basically say in the national security strategy is that we face 2 strategic challenges at once on an equal plane of importance. Geopolitical competition against two countries that do not share our vision of what the world should look like, or what a just society should look like. As they put people in cages for victimless crimes, Jake Sullivan is warning us that people out 3,000 miles away might be disrupting our way of life. Many people, when it comes to, hey, watch out for war with China over Taiwan, watch out for war with Russia, will say, well, of course, you can't be one of these Chamberlain appeasers. How do you just sit back and let these people do terrible things? But of course, when the domestic government does terrible things, you just have to do whatever the cops say and hopefully take it up with the courts 2 years later. So what you can ask yourself is, can we falsify this theory that, well, sitting back and just doing nothing doesn't do anything, and then the enemy just grows bigger and bigger? There are examples of restraint shown by President Eisenhower in 1956. The Soviet Union murdered civilians in Hungary when they had an uprising in 1956. China in 1964 had Project 596, which was them exploding an atomic bomb in the ocean. As a result of this, Nixon and Kissinger went to later shake hands with Chairman Mao. We can't negotiate with President Xi. He's crazy. We'll have to go to war, but we could negotiate with Mao. We can't talk to Vladimir Putin. He's just evil and crazy, but we can form an alliance with Joseph Stalin. They also had no problem forming an alliance with Mohammed bin Salman, the mass murderer of Yemen. When it comes to NATO claiming that, well, NATO is for democracy, and if you're against NATO, you support autocracy. This is not even close to being historically true. Antonio Salazar was the dictator of Portugal for many years while being a member of NATO. Greece had the regime of the colonels from 1967 to 1974. No democracy, never kicked out of NATO. Vladimir Zelensky, the NATO soldier boy currently, has nationalized the media, outlawed competing political parties, instituted conscription. He bombed Poland, killed 2 civilians, lied and blamed it on Russia, and has confiscated the property of many Eastern Orthodox churches. This is the organization that is going to protect Taiwan. The first time NATO ever declared war, it's called Article 5, was 52 years after its existence, and the war took place in Afghanistan. After 20 years, trillions of dollars, people getting their limbs blown off, thousands of civilian deaths, the Taliban took over in 11 days. And now they want a war with nuclear China and nuclear Russia. So you might say, well, you know, it's kind of cowardly to care about things like the non-aggression principle. This is about power. We have to, really exert ourselves in the world. So it's important to note that many great empires have fallen as a causal result of overexpansion. The US regime knows this clearly. They say, how are we going to weaken the Soviet Union? Bog them down in Afghanistan. How are we going to weaken Putin? Bog them down in Ukraine. But allegedly, when the US goes to war, it actually grows the economy because that's what stimulates growth. They know that this is a lie just like anyone else. So can we find examples historically of empires collapsing as a causal result of overexpansion? Well, basically every empire, this is how they fall, whether it's the French Empire, the British Empire after the World Wars. The Tsarist government in 1917 fell while its soldiers were not defending the homeland, but involved in a war in Germany and France. The Japanese Empire fell as a result of overexpansion. The German Empire fell after it declared war on Russia in the First World War conflict. The Ottoman Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, not to mention the Soviet Empire. There was a book actually written in 1928 by Arthur Ponsonby titled Falsehood in Wartime. He goes over examples of things such as the mutilated nurse fake news, the Belgian baby without hands, babies on bayonets, crucified Canadians, the German corpse factory. And in 1928, he developed the thesis. He goes, okay, how is it that all these governments and all these people are lying? These governments that hate each other, it looks almost as if they're conspiring and planning on these lies. Here's what he came away with. Falsehood is a recognized and extremely useful weapon in warfare, and every country uses it quite deliberately to deceive its own people, to attract neutrals, and to mislead the enemy. The ignorant and innocent masses in each country are unaware at the time they are being misled, And when it is all over, only here and there are the falsehoods discovered and exposed. A useful purpose can therefore be served in the interval of so-called peace by warning which people can examine with dispassionate calm that the authorities in each country do, and indeed must resort to this practice in order first to justify themselves by depicting the enemy as an undiluted criminal, and secondly, to inflame popular passion sufficiently to secure recruits for the continuance of the struggle. They cannot afford to tell the truth. So what Ponsonby is saying is, all right, you know how whenever you get one of those emails that says, look, I got $10 million, I want to split it with you, but I just need you to send me $1,000 now. You look at those and you go, well, that's a scam. That's not worth looking into. There's no way the incentives match up. It just can't be true, so you delete it and don't think of it. That is how Ponsonby is telling us to look at. New intelligence comes out of China and says, Nigerian email scam. That's all we have to start thinking when we see things that the corporate press is telling us about. Something happened and yada, yada, yada. Millions of men have to get conscripted and tons of civilians need to die. The brief anti-war case, the immediate costs of war are clearly awful, and the long-run benefits of war are highly uncertain. Again, the war they call the good war, the one they brag about, led to tens of millions of deaths and Stalin taking over half of Europe. Again, the state is the health of war. It's not just that war is the health of the state, with things like the central bank, the ability to raise funds through taxation, the ability to conscript a military, compulsory school where they teach kids to propaganda lies, and the legal double standard, which allows them to kill with impunity. So when we see this, it can be quite the black pill. Oh gosh, what do we do? It's like, well, Trump is running again. Maybe he won't get totally bought off. Oh, Trump's getting arrested. Oh no, God, who's going to run now? Kaiser Wilhelm wrote a series of memoirs after he took off the throne. He moved to the Netherlands and started writing. Here is what he said about why Germany lost the First World War. Kaiser says, I cannot bring myself to dismiss this propaganda by branding it with catchwords such as a piece of rascality, etc., since it constitutes an achievement which, in spite of its repugnant nature, cannot be ignored. It did us more harm than the arms in the hands of our opponents. The English were more than our match with that terrible weapon of theirs, the tank, against which we could bring nothing of equal efficiency. So also, they were superior to us with their very effective weapon of propaganda. The unjust peace of Versailles could not have been founded upon Germany's war guilt unless propaganda had previously accomplished its task, and partly with the support of German pacifists. Instilled into the brains of 100 million human beings the belief in Germany's guilt, so that the unjust peace of Versailles seemed to so many justified. Even the people in the know talk about the power of general public opinion. So, what do we do? Well, I think the best thing that we can do is find ourselves the best propagandist, ask him to run, and if he doesn't want to, just waterboard him relentlessly until he agrees to. So in looking for who our next propagandist should be, an article came across me the other day from The Independent by Skylar Baker Jordan from August of 2022. She says, I went to a right-wing libertarian conference as a socialist, and I was pleasantly surprised by what I found. We are libertarians because we love liberty and hate injustice, comedian Dave Smith said in remarks on the opening night. The reason we are libertarians is because governments destroy innocent people's lives and we hate that. Smith went on to speak about the Patriot Act, the imperialist wars such as Iraq and Afghanistan, and in favor of civil liberties. The exact issues which motivated me to get involved in left-leaning politics in the early 2000s. Many of you will remember that the previous regime of the LP said, if LPMC gets in there, it's going to be a hard right turn. We got to go. The chair was so terrified, he staged an assault incident. He was so dedicated to this. They caught him on camera, and he realizes he's been caught, and he says, this dude has unauthorized recording. I need to get to a microphone. I've been assaulted. That's how terrified they were of the LPMC takeover. And what happened was more leftists were attracted to us than before because of people from the LPMC. Dave's done an excellent job getting 10 million views on the Joe Rogan Experience talking about Ukraine, 3 million talking about Yemen, vaccine passports, and the CNN military-industrial complex connection. Dave was on Jimmy Dore's show, Glenn Beck's show, Kennedy Nation, Tim Pool, Megyn Kelly. Greg Gutfeld even came out and said, it's people like Glenn Greenwald, Kat Timpf, and Dave Smith, which really showed me that I was in fact wrong about these wars of aggression. So when it comes to who should our next person be, I think the LPMC, in a time of provoking a third world war, is our best chance to find our propagandist, so to speak. And when it comes to how difficult things can seem, we might say, well, we disagree with people on like thousands of things. How are we going to convince them on all, like they can't even get agricultural subsidies. And we're like trying to get them to, oppose the Yanukovych regime and not just Zelensky. Well, it's actually just one thing that we disagree on that is underlying so many of these other issues. And once they get that principle, all else falls from there. That would be the non-aggression principle. It's wrong to initiate violence against non-aggressors. So when Murray Rothbard said, to use the phrases of the New Left of the late 1960s, the ruling elite must be demystified, delegitimated, and de-sanctified. When it comes to achieving that, I think the LPMC is by far and away the liberty movement's best hope, and I think Dave Smith is our best candidate to take that forward. Thank you guys so much for your time.
Thank you so very much. And I think that I speak for a lot of people here when I say we absolutely agree with your assessment there at the end. Thank you so much. So we are going to roll right into our third speaker. Our third speaker is going to be Mike Meharry. So we're excited about that. Mike is the communications director for the 10th Amendment Center. He's a contributor of podcasts like Godarchy, Shift Gold, right? And for me, an inspiration for my own research in public safety, his incredible work in local policing. If you've not read it, is something that you have to see. And more recently, Mike has acted as a trainer as we prepare our candidates to exact a nullification strategy across the country. So ladies and gentlemen, we're proud to have him. Mike, please come on up.
Thank you guys so much. It is so good to be here. I'm going to try to adjust this a little bit. Here in the big New York City, how many people are local, like from this area? Cool, most of you. So I came up here from Central Florida and got out of the airport yesterday and immediately began to question the wisdom of leaving Central Florida and coming to New York this time of year because I froze my rear end off yesterday. But it's worth it to be here with you fine people today. So also, there's some weird things in New York City. I saw a guy when I was coming here walking up Broadway with golf clubs. Like, where is he going to play golf? Anyway. So, I like bumper stickers. Yeah, I guess that is playing through. I like bumper stickers. You get behind a car and you can kind of get a sense of somebody's worldview by reading their bumper stickers if they happen to have them. And what I've learned over the last number of years is that most people have a kind of confused worldview. I'll give you an example. You've got the guy with the big pickup and he's got the come and take it bumper sticker, right? Nobody's going to take his guns. And then right next to it, he's got the thin blue line. And I always want to go and bang on his window and go, dude, who do you think is going to come and take it? It's the thin blue line guys. So I was behind this woman not too long ago, and she had a bumper sticker on her car that said, resist. I'm like, that's cool. I'm down with that. We could use a little resistance in this crazy world. But then right next to it, right next to resist, is Joe Biden. Worst resistance ever, right? We've got arguably the biggest government in the history of the world that claims almost unlimited power over us. These people tell us how much water we can have in our toilets, right? And she's going to resist by putting another old guy in charge of this system. That's not how resistance works. You don't resist an evil, corrupt, overreaching, monolith monster state by changing out one cog in the system, right? If you've got a broken up system, you resist it by like taking a cog out, throwing a monkey wrench in it, or best case scenario, take a hammer and smash the whole thing, right? So I want to talk today about something that we can actually do to resist the monster state. Actual resistance, take human action, something that we can do as people who are into activism, into the political process. I have a blueprint for facing down this monster federal government. Now, I don't know if, I can't remember my introduction even, but I'm the National Communications Director at the 10th Amendment Center. You guys are probably familiar with what we do. And you know that at the 10th Amendment Center, we talk a lot about the Constitution. In fact, I wrote a book about it. And here's my shameless plug. I brought some with me. And I really don't want to put them back in my suitcase. So I would love for folks to buy a copy. I'll take $20, Federal Reserve notes, and I will give you a copy of this book. And that would be great. I'm over here next to my good friends at the Libertarian Christian Institute. You want to check out their table as well. So you might be thinking to yourself, well, Mike, you know, I'm not so sure this whole Constitution thing is the best course of resistance either. And, you know, that's fair. I get it. And I bet you dollars to donuts, and I really like donuts, that somebody in here is thinking right now, Lysander Spooner. Am I right? Somebody thinking Spooner, right? It's the famous quote. But whether the Constitution really be one thing or another, this much is certain, that it has either authorized such a government as we have had, or has been powerless to prevent it. In either case, it is unfit to exist. Well, game, set, match, Meharry, pack up your stupid book and go home. No. In fact, with all due respect to Spooner, and I love his argument against the idea of consent, that we have not consented to the Constitution, fantastic. But I've always found this particular quote to be honestly kind of a dumb guy argument. And it's funny because people like to throw it at me like that. Oh, we got Meharry now. I almost quit. As if I've never heard this before, right? But I say it's a dumb guy argument because it's wrong. In the first place, the Constitution certainly didn't authorize such a government as what we have. Everybody who supported the ratification of the Constitution argued that what we got today was not the intent. There was nobody running around saying, oh, we're going to build a monster state with this Constitution. Now, you could say that maybe they were lying, they were being duplicitous. That's fine. But that's not what they said, right? And the Constitution is a legal document, so we know what it says and what it means. You can read my book and find out. James Madison in Federalist number 45, I think, summed up best what the federal government system that we have was supposed to look like. He said, the powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. And he said, those which remain with the states and the people are numerous and indefinite. And he goes on and he talks about the fact that the federal powers would primarily have to do with war and peace, foreign trade, and that all of the things that had to do with the life, liberty, and prosperity of the states and the people would remain with the states and the people. That's the system that the Constitution authorized. Now, obviously, it looks nothing like that. So maybe Spooner was right about the second part, that it was powerless to prevent it. And you know what? I'm going to concede Spooner's point there. It was powerless to prevent it because it's a darn piece of paper with words on it. Words on paper don't have any power to do anything at all, right? They don't enforce themselves. Even the founding generation understood this. James Madison called constitutions parchment barriers. So we can't expect to just wave it around and the government people are going to say, oh, you've got a constitution there. I'm not going to do anything. No, that's not how it works. Let's say Amy and I enter into a contract for something. And I start violating the terms and just not doing what the contract says I'm supposed to do. And let's say Amy, all she does is complain about it, and she calls me a poo-poo duty head. But she doesn't do anything. Like, she doesn't do anything to enforce it. She didn't go to court. She didn't do anything at all. She just complains about it. Maybe she waves the paper at me. Well, whose fault is it that the Constitution contract between us is not being enforced? It's her fault, because she didn't do anything about it. And that's what we're here to talk about today. There has to be some type of enforcement mechanism. And this actually, believe it or not, brings me back to Spooner. Because Spooner gave us a blueprint to enforce the Constitution before he talked about how it had no authority. But thinking about enforcement, I want to go just real quick, a couple of founding fathers. I hate the term founding fathers, but that's what we call them. Founding generation, I like to say. John Dickinson, he was known as the penman of the Revolution, very influential in the lead up to the War for Independence and also afterwards during the ratification of the Constitution. John Dickinson said it is ultimately up to the people to enforce the Constitution. The supreme sovereignty of the people is what he said. And he wrote, it is their duty to watch and their right to take care that the Constitution be preserved. So just like it's Amy's responsibility to make sure that our contract is enforced, or my responsibility from my side of it, it is the people's responsibility, us, to ensure that the Constitution is enforced. So Spooner, in 1850, he wrote an essay. It was called A Defense of Fugitive Slaves, and it was in response to the Fugitive Slave Act. Horrible law, one of the most draconian things ever passed by Congress, and Congress has passed a lot of draconian things. But basically, under the Fugitive Slave Act, I could go to a black person, and I could say, this is my property. And I could take them, this is in the North, I could take them back south as a slave, and they couldn't even testify in their own defense. It was basically my word against theirs. Horrible, horrible law. And Spooner was very active in resisting the Fugitive Slave Act. He was a very staunch abolitionist, and he wrote this essay. And his argument fundamentally was that the Fugitive Slave Act was unconstitutional. Interesting argument from Spooner, right? That was his argument. Listen to what he wrote. He said, an unconstitutional statute is no law in the view of the Constitution. It is void and confirms no authority on anyone, and whoever attempts to execute it does so at his peril. And then he goes on and he tells us what we should do about it. Resist. Not the Joe Biden way, but actual resistance. He says the right of the people, therefore, to resist an unconstitutional law is absolute and unqualified from the moment the law is enacted. So when I'm talking about resisting unconstitutional acts, I'm not talking about some kind of rebellion or some kind of radical, horrible thing. I'm talking about what we are supposed to do. And it wasn't just Spooner. James Iredell, North Carolina, one of the very first Supreme Court justices, he said this: the right of the people, therefore, to resist an unconstitutional law is absolute and unqualified from the moment the law is enacted. It sounds a lot like what Spooner said. In fact, it was the same. So that brings us to the question, the nuts and bolts of the matter. How do we resist? What am I talking about here? This is all words, and it sounds cool, and everybody's like, yeah, let's resist. How do we do it? Now, I suppose we could go the violence route. Not really my thing. I don't really want to get into a shooting war with feds. I don't think that would be particularly effective. I don't know that it won't come to that someday, but right now, I would prefer a more moderate course of action. And fortunately, there is one. I think a good way to resist is to simply refuse to comply or to cooperate with the thing that's being done that is unjust or unlawful, right? Just don't do it. And this is actually the blueprint that James Madison gave us for protecting the Constitution. Remember, I said James Madison understood that a Constitution was simply parchment barriers. This came up during the ratification debates. Everybody was saying, as I mentioned, that this Constitution was going to create a relatively limited general government with very few powers. And people were asking the question, well, how in the heck are we going to keep them within those limits? Need a drink. How do we keep this government within those limits? Federalist number 46, which incidentally is right after Federalist number 45, for those of you who are math challenged. Federalist 46, James Madison actually talked about and answered this question. And he gave us this blueprint of how to deal with overreaching federal power. He called them unwarranted actions. And he said if the federal government commits an unwarranted action, there are things that we can do. And actually, he said even an unwarranted or a warrantable action, something that is constitutional, he said even in this case, there are things that we can do. And he made this list. He talked about things like governors protesting, and he talked about petitions, a lot of things that we think of in your traditional activism. But the key thing that Madison told us that we could do was a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. This is James Madison, the so-called father of the Constitution, telling us that what we should do if the federal government overreaches is a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. Those are his exact words. He said if one state was to do this, it would create serious impediments to whatever the federal government was trying to do. He said if numerous states took this action, it would create obstructions which the federal government would hardly be willing to encounter. Now, he was onto something here because of the nature of the federal government. There's a reason that this refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union works. And that reason is the federal government has a resource problem. They do not have the personnel or the resources to enforce all of the federal laws or implement all of its federal programs. It depends on state and local action to do all of this stuff that it does. During the fake government shutdown back in 2013 when Obama was president, you remember that? They actually, they closed outside. They closed the national park. They didn't actually shut down anything that you would want to shut down. They didn't shut down the wars or the IRS or any of that. But they did shut down the park. So we had this fake government shutdown. We're about to have another fake government shutdown, by the way, in this summer, so that'll be fun. But the National Association of States, so state governors, they sent out a letter. They were all worried about this government shutdown because they said that the states are partners with the federal government in almost everything. Now think about that. If the states are partners with the federal governments in almost everything, and the states say, we're not going to be partners with you guys anymore, imagine what's going to happen. It's about teamwork, right? And teamwork doesn't work when half the team quits. So my suggestion is that we need to encourage states and localities and individuals to stop being part of the team. It's as simple as that. Refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. You might be thinking, well, Mike, how's this going to work? Well, it's already working. I was sitting back there a while ago and I thought, I smell weed. In fact, I can go up the street and buy weed. You know, the federal government says you can't do that, right? It's illegal. It's federally illegal. There's total federal prohibition on marijuana. And yet, we have 37 states now that have medical marijuana. And Delaware is about to legalize. Their bill just went to the governor to completely legalize marijuana. That would be, I think, the 20th state. So we're getting close to half the states. Federal government's over here. You can't have marijuana. And yet, you can have marijuana. That's because the federal government cannot enforce prohibition without the cooperation of the states. And at this point, the federal government has basically given up. Now, don't get me wrong. It's not that the federal government can't do anything. I know it can cause problems. There's banking issues. You know, you can still have big drug raids. And that's where human action becomes even more important, right? Somebody's got to stand up and draw the line in the sand. Back in 1996, California was the first state to legalize medical marijuana. And at the time, it was pretty risky because they're going out there alone, right? And the federal government did try to enforce. Some people will say, oh, well, the whole reason it worked is because the federal government didn't even try to enforce it. That's not true. Ask anybody who was involved in those early days in California. There were numerous drug raids. But you know what would happen? The feds would go in and shut down a medical marijuana dispensary, and they'd have that bad boy open back up in the afternoon. And people did go to jail. People suffered. There were people that sacrificed because they thought that this was so important. And I think sometimes we have to be willing to do that and to pick our battles. But this is a thing that will work. And we can take this model for marijuana that we've seen work, and we can apply it to just about anything the federal government does. Federal gun ban, state and local governments don't have to enforce it. Obamacare, state and local governments don't have to implement that program. Even with things like money, we can do things at the state level to encourage sound money and break the Fed's monopoly on money. There are all kinds of things. That's what we do at the 10th Amendment Center. So if you're interested in kind of the nuts and bolts, the issues and how we apply it to various issues, even the wars, talking about the wars, Defend the Guard, awesome bill, would prohibit governors from allowing National Guard units to enter into active duty combat without a declaration of war. There are things that state and local governments can do, a power to resist. Now, the other argument that I often get is, well, you can't do that. Supremacy clause and all of these constitutional issues. Here's the beauty of this. We call it the anti-commandeering strategy, this Madisonian Spooner-esque blueprint. The Supreme Court has held consistently since 1842 that the state and local governments do not have to use their resources or their personnel to enforce any federal law or implement any federal program. This is a settled legal doctrine. The federal government can't make the state of New York enforce immigration. That's why these sanctuary districts work. Now, you may not like that particular policy. Nevertheless, the federal government can't make the state enforce it if they don't want to. The federal government can't force Missouri to enforce federal gun control. Can't do it. Set in law. Now, I don't really generally care what a bunch of politically connected lawyers say about the Constitution, because 99.99% of the time they're wrong. But in this case, it gives us a very valuable tool to implement this blueprint that Madison gave us to refuse to cooperate with officers of the Union. And it can even start at the local level in some cases. There's some legal things that you kind of have to wrangle around when you're trying to do local nullification. We call this nullification. It's a cool word. But it can be used from the individual level up to the state level to break up this most powerful government in the history of the world. The thing I like about the Constitution, and I know it has its problems. I bust on Spooner because people like to bust on me about Spooner. But I recognize the inherent difficulties with the Constitution. I'm actually a voluntarist, so I agree with the fact that really you can't bind a bunch of people to something they've never consented to. Nevertheless, why bother with the Constitution? Because it is the framework that people in the United States understand, right? If I go to somebody out here in the street and start talking about Rothbard and the illegitimacy of the state, they're going to be like, this guy is nuts. If I go out there and start talking to them about the Constitution, they may still think I'm nuts, but they'll have some frame of reference for me to work within, right? And the beauty of the constitutional system, as broken as it is, it still has the vestiges of decentralization within it. Because in effect, it is a decentralized system. State and local governments have a lot of power. We need to harness that power to decentralize and break up the system. I don't like state governments or local governments any more than I like the federal government, but I do like decentralization. And that's why I'm so much an advocate of this particular strategy, because it is decentralizing in nature. And it's something that we can all do. It's something that the Libertarian Party can do. Even if you don't have people in office, you can get involved with coalitions, with other groups to do these type of local and state nullification efforts. We've got a lot of folks in the LP, particularly the Mises Caucus, who are working very hard to get Defend the Guard passed, the bill that I just mentioned about the National Guard. It actually passed the Arizona Senate a couple of weeks ago. First time that bill has ever passed a full chamber. So that's what we're about at the 10th Amendment Center. Like I said, you can get more details about the nuts and bolts of this strategy if you go to 10thamendmentcenter.com, and you can see how that we're applying this. But I just want to put this bug in your head that this is something that we can do. that this is a workable, practical, it's a policy that works. That's the bottom line of it. I want to close out my little talk with one of my favorite historical incidents of nullification. It's actually local nullification. It's not even local, it's individual nullification. And I mentioned earlier that with the legalization of marijuana, a lot of people had to make sacrifices. A lot of people had to stand up and put their property and even their freedom on the line because they believed it was important. I respect people like that. I admire people like that because, quite frankly, sometimes I lack that courage. But you can look at folks that have that kind of courage and take, you can learn from that and be inspired by that. One of my favorites is Rosa Parks. And you all know this story, or at least the basics of the story, but I'm not sure that folks really understand exactly what she did and what happened. So at that time, as the story goes, and as we all know, Black people had to sit at the back of the bus. But it wasn't like there was a section where they were automatically supposed to go. The way it actually worked is the buses had these little signs, at least the ones in Birmingham, Montgomery, in Alabama. They had these little signs, right? And they would put the sign on the row, and the Black people had to sit behind the sign. But they could move the little signs. So on the day that Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat, she was actually initially sitting where she was supposed to be, minding her own business. There were 3 other Black folks who were sitting near her. But as it happened, it was raining that day, and the bus filled up very quickly. And they got to a stop, and there was a bunch of people getting on the bus. So the bus driver gets up, and he grabs that little sign, and he moves it behind the rows where Rosa was sitting. And the 3 other people that were now sitting in the wrong part of the bus, they all 3 got up, immediately went to the back. Rosa simply didn't move. This is what she said in her autobiography. She said, "When he saw me still sitting, he asked if I was going to stand up. And I said, no, I'm not. And he said, well, if you don't stand up, I'm going to have to call the police and have you arrested. And I said, you may do that. Gives me chills because, so I think sometimes we think when we talk about resistance, we think about, punching somebody in the head or taking a wrench and wrecking something. She said no. And then when challenged, she said, okay, you may do that. Now notice what she didn't do. She didn't punch the bus driver in the face. She didn't burn the bus. She just simply refused to give in to what she viewed to be unjust and something that was just violated all human nature. So what happened? She did end up getting arrested. She was sentenced. I think she was sentenced to disorderly conduct. She was fined $10, $4 in court costs. And she also lost her job. She was a seamstress. She lost her job because of the publicity that this brought up. This is what she said also in her autobiography, and I find this extremely powerful. She said, people always say that I didn't give up my seat because I was tired. But that isn't true. I was not tired physically, or no more tired than I usually was at the end of a working day. I was not old, although some people have an image of me as being old then. I was 42. That seems young to me now. She said, no, the only tired I was tired of getting in. That's a powerful statement. Now, some people say, well, Mike, she was a political activist, yada, yada. Maybe she was, maybe she wasn't. The fact of the matter is she didn't get on the bus that day intending to create a movement. She got on that bus that day trying to get freaking home from work. And it was the last straw, the straw that broke the camel back. And she's like, I'm not doing this anymore because it's not right. And she was willing to do it, and she was willing to face the consequences. And because of her actions, this sparked the Montgomery bus boycott. And I say it lit the fire that ultimately consumed Jim Crow. We can talk about all the federal laws and all that stuff. Now, that's not what did it. It was the fact that she stood up and said no, and other people like, I'm gonna stand up and say no too. And it worked. So that's what I want to leave you guys with today. I know, because of the fact that you are all here on a Saturday day, it's raining, granted, but there's a lot of stuff you can do here in New York City, right? There's a lot of stuff you could do instead of sitting here listening to me blather on about the Constitution. But you choose to be here because I know you are tired of giving in. You are tired of putting up with the freaking government telling you what to do, taking your wealth, killing your friends in unnecessary wars. You're fed up. Well, we can resist. We don't have to go out and buy guns and shoot up a bunch of people. All we have to do is refuse to cooperate with the officers of the union. We're creating a structure that we can do that in the political system. You can find ways to do it in your own lives. I just bought some gold backs, little gold papers. Great way. If we create alternate currencies, alternate barter systems, there are things we can do. Be creative. Keep standing up. Keep doing what you're doing. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for being here. Buy my book so I don't have to take it home.
I've got 15 minutes to go.
Okay.
We're gonna take a good 20.
Okay, so for our friends online, we're gonna take a quick break. We'll be back in about 20 minutes. For our friends here, if you have ordered lunch, sandwiches are gonna be going over there. And then we have a lunch speaker, that's Gene Epstein. It's not something that you wanna miss. So we'll see you guys back here, 20 minutes. Also get beer, yeah.